Hello, welcome and good evening to our launch of Robert's wonderful book, Barn Club. My name's Muna. I am head of editorial at Chelsea Green, Robert's delighted and very proud publisher. Before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. We will be recording this and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel for those who've missed it or want to watch it again, just so everyone's aware. But to tell you a little about Barn Club, Robert's fantastic new book. I joined Chelsea Green about the time that Robert delivered his manuscript. So it was one of the first things I read and I was completely entranced by it. Robert is a lifelong woodworker, a skilled carpenter and trained in design and engineering, but he's also a beautiful writer. And Barn Club tells of his discovery of the elm tree in his local woods when he moved to Hertfordshire with his wife Lydia. And it's about how Robert revived an ancient craft, one that has been familiar in villages throughout the country, an ancient craft that brought a community together to build a structure, skilled and unskilled. And this is what happened 200 years later in a village in Hertfordshire. Robert is going to discuss the story of the elm trees and how they became a barn in conversation with Ben Raskin, who is head of Horticulture and Agroforestry at the Soil Association. And they're going to be joined by some of Robert's volunteers from the Barn Club, because it's a magical story that offers lyrical narrative, technical detail about timber framing, and a joyous final chapter where the barn is raised and Robert writes, we had all become something bigger than any of us. And I think that's true of the book itself, because Barn Club, so to date, has inspired the bookseller who featured it as one of the best covers of the March books publishing this year. We've had some wonderful, generous support from Kate Humble, Gillian Burt, Barnspoon, Jack Sobon, Professor Richard Buggs, and John Hansel, who've all given us generous words. We have some brilliant and some very exciting press to come. And so before I hand over to Robert and Ben, I want to just raise a glass and to toast this book and say congratulations, Robert, on your publication day to Barn Club. Hooray.
It's Barn Club.
Over to you guys.
Thanks, Muna.
Thank you.
So a couple of things just before we dive straight in. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A button and there's a chat button. So if you've got any questions you'd like me to put to Robert during the conversation, then put them into the Q&A. If it's sort of just chat, comments, anything else that springs to mind, then that can go in the chat. And it's really fantastic. We've got a lot of the volunteers that work with Robert on the call as well. So I'd really encourage those volunteers to supplement Robert's narrative with sort of comments and experience of your own in the chat. That would really add, I think, to tonight. So I guess, first of all, I loved reading this book, and I think I mentioned to you I just finished reading Roger Deakins' Wildwood, which is sort of immersed in the walnut forests and Australia, and then sort of coming right back into sort of directly into the UK. It was a natural progression, and a lot of the book was quite familiar to me. I'm a gardener. I mostly work with trees and plants while they're still alive, but that side of it felt quite familiar, and I've got a fair amount of experience of community growing, so the community aspect sort of felt quite comfortable for me. But I know almost nothing about carpentry, despite these sort of pseudo backdrop of mine. I'm a DIY bodger. I've got no skills, and I realized as I read through that I knew almost nothing about elm as well, and despite it being my grandfather's favorite tree, for me it was a bit of a distant memory. And you talk in the book about being in George Orwell's barn and recognizing that it was made of elm. But so, I guess for you already knew about elm by that stage. Where did you first come across elm? Where's the sort of beginning of that story for you?
As a child, seeing the giant elm trees around East Kent, where I grew up, I can remember exactly being on the school bus and seeing in the middle of summer 3 large trees in a row without any leaves at all on as the bus went by, and wondering what on earth was going on. And of course, that was just the beginning of Dutch elm disease coming through in the 1970s. On the farm where I grew up, I was able to use some of that wood then to start making things, and that was really my beginning of my love affair with elm wood, and using it mostly for more cabinet works than barns, I must say. But moving to Hertfordshire several decades later and discovering live elm trees, large trees, very large trees, and quite a few of them, completely blew me away. So I knew there would.
How did you make that discovery? Did you just sort of walk past and notice there's some there? Because I'm not sure I'd even recognise an elm tree.
Yeah, well, really the way elm is quite unique in that the leaf shape, which is like an oval, but right at the base of the stalk, where the leaf comes out, it's asymmetrical. So rather than coming out together, the leaf begins one side a bit higher than the other. So that's how you can identify elm. But bit by bit, I began to see that elm was a particular shape of tree, so I could see it from further away, recognize it in the landscape. And something very interesting is, at the moment, if you've been outside today, I'm sure you have, but if anyone's been outside, you'll just notice the trees are bare. There's clearly no leaves out. The big trees are still in their winter coats, with the exception of elm trees. And this is amazing. Elm trees are just coming to the end of their blossom time, because they do have blossom. And I've got some blossom here I want to show everybody. It's the most beautiful thing. The Japanese celebrate cherry blossom. I think we should celebrate elm. Here's a twig of elm. I'll push it really close so you can see it's an amazing ruby red. All those, there's a whole bunch of small florets there, and each tree might have thousands, tens of thousands of these flowers. So at the moment, if you're near an elm tree and look up, you'll see that there's this kind of beautiful tinge of ruby red or pink. It varies a bit depending on the type of elm tree. And then once you've seen that, you begin to be able to recognize elms perhaps from half a mile away, because you see amongst all the bare trees this kind of high level carpet of pink and red. Really beautiful.
Fantastic. And I mean, obviously it had a very special place in the landscape, but why is it sort of particularly useful as a building wood? And you talk a bit about some of the particular properties of elm wood. Why did you choose elm for the barn?
Well, it was really discovering in the first instance that barn of George Orwell's was made of elm. And so I started looking around near where I lived and found that a lot of barns that seemed to have been made in the 18th century were elm rather than oak. So that was really interesting. I'd not heard of that. That seemed something that perhaps, again, people hadn't realized. Mostly people think it's oak, as indeed the owner of that barn had thought as well. And then this barn here, that you can see the wall behind me, that's all elm. You're just looking at elm. And this was the first barn we built with the help of volunteers on our own small holding. So this was built again in the way that they would have built 250 years ago.
Fantastic.
I don't think I particularly answered your question as why elm, but I'm really saying I'm following in the footsteps of what our forebears did in order to discover why elm. And in the book, it describes in more detail the structure of elm wood, but it's incredibly strong across the grain. So if you're making a mortise and tenon joint, it's a really, really strong joint in elm. So that I think they realized that back in the day and started switching to elm rather than oak.
So a very practical choice, really.
Yes, I think they'd have been pragmatic about it. It would be a practical thing. It worked. Elm trees grow considerably faster than oak trees, and you can mill them right to the sapwood. So you probably on a small tree get twice the amount of useful timber from the same size tree, and at a much younger age. Now, in the 18th century, they were starting to sort of rationalize forestry, I suppose, or the planting out of new plantations and hedgerow trees to satisfy demand for construction timber.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
And the survival of elm trees was, I guess, the first big surprise for me. Is, in my head they were all dead, and I mean, I knew there were small ones, but yeah. I didn't realize, as I think probably you did at that stage, quite how many had survived. Does that give us, it obviously gives us hope for elm, but is there anything we can learn from that story for the current problems of ash and chestnut and oak and all these other things that are likely to have problems?
Well, I think back in the 70s, probably a few mistakes were made in terms of trying to contain the disease and so forth. So it just let rip through the countryside. And there hasn't, sadly with elm, there hasn't been a concerted national attempt to find the exact genetic sequencing of different elm hybrids and which ones are resistant to Dutch elm disease and which ones aren't. So the knowledge, well, it's obvious to me by observation that there are elms out there that seem to be completely happy with Dutch elm disease circulating in the hedgerows around them, and they survive and seem unaffected. So there's got to be a reason for that, and I think that needs proper research, and then we can hope to propagate from there, or take crosses or back crosses with other type of elms with greater resistance from abroad, and then we can definitely think about restocking the landscape with these trees. And it's worth saying as well that up until perhaps halfway through the last century, elm and ash and oak would have been the predominant trees. So it's hard to imagine if one of those three species was to seemingly disappear, with 95% or more of those trees gone within a decade or two.
Yeah. So you've chosen your tree species, I guess. You've decided what it's going to be, and that takes us from that story of elm, which there's still so much to learn about. It's the beginning of the story in a lot of ways, but in terms of the barn itself, we'll move on, I guess, to the craft of creating a barn, and there are a couple of things, I guess. One is actually one of the bits I loved was that description when you go into the woods with the group of volunteers to choose the trees. But I guess even stepping back a little bit, why did you choose to do it as a community group, as a barn club? Why, with a group of people who I'm guessing didn't know what they were doing to start with? Why do it in that way? Yeah,
it's a good question. It's important, and it wasn't really a decision I made. It was that people offered to help when they heard we were making the barn here. Even when it came to just digging the foundations on the first day, two friends turned up and said, "Come on, let's get to it." So after that, it just it kind of snowballed, and then friends of friends, and then people I'd never met before got in touch, and you realized that working outside is what people yearn to do, and do something with their hands, learn a skill, and work together. Even work together with people they've never met before. It's fine. You soon lock in, and there's good companionship, and there's usually a nice bowl of soup or something for lunch, and people really enjoyed it. And I think it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't fun. Absolutely not.
We'll come back to that community definitely later on in the conversation. So you're in the woods with this group, and maybe we'll even hear from Esther or one of the other volunteers about that experience. But you're looking at presumably a group of trees, and choosing which one to mill. I quite like that sort of decision-making process, and you seem to sort of have in your head a kind of quite a visual image of what you needed and how that fitted into the trees.
Yes, I mean it's worth saying that for I don't know, many decades really, I'm used to going into woods, finding the trees, not necessarily elm, but whatever I'm working with, and then paying people to then use those trees or use their timber. So that side of thing, I think, is part of my way of working as a carpenter or designer. I strongly believe that we need to connect with our local landscape and use those local natural materials. And that is a very traditional thing. There's nothing particularly new about that. But the new thing was doing it with with volunteers and not paying people to do it, but open it up as perhaps more of a social enterprise rather than a carpentry enterprise. It's a bit like you do community supported agriculture. Why not community supported timber frame carpentry as an idea?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, that thing about going out into the wider landscape to find our material, partly because being in the wood, you're there with the trees, you really experience the whole habitat, the ecosystem, you see the wildlife, you know how important it is. So you're in awe of that whole system, really. So it's not just a piece of wood that comes off a delivery truck. You know that a piece of wood is part of a tree, and that tree comes from somewhere, and it was someone's home at one point, maybe a bird or a lichen, who knows.
So you're already building that connection with the material that you're then going to work with. You're almost sort of giving birth to the material. I mean, that's maybe a bit of a strange way of saying it, but you're sort of there with it right from the start.
Yeah, and I think particularly with building barn structures where it's quite all right to have a little bit of wane or curve in some of the timbers, you can still see the tree in the finished building, which and certainly when we were working with the timber after it had been milled, you could still see the shapes within that came from the tree itself. We just followed the shapes of the trees when we were milling. So in that sense, you're still working with something that in your mind you can go back to its source. And I think the thing about elm, and why I focus so much in the book about elm, is that we can have an experience of nature. We can cycle along the lanes and see the trees. Whether we know the names of those trees or not, another matter. And we know that we're part of nature, that we breathe air, we eat food, we drink water. And people want to connect with nature, but I think it needs to go deeper. I think we need to deeply bond with nature. And one way of doing that as a craftsperson is to go and find your materials in those ecosystems. And certainly for me, spending enough time with trees, or with elm trees, to be in total awe of them is a good place to start. To be in amazement. Can I read you something from the book?
I'd love you. Yeah.
That's in with that. This follows I've got three paragraphs about elm, and following from starting off about the joy of discovering an elm tree. There is nothing more satisfying than to turn a corner in a country lane to discover a majestic elm, 4 feet across at its base, standing 70 feet high, with glorious sweeping branches and filigree leaves and twigs. Some of these trees are in their prime and are magnificent. Bearing in mind that most people think that elms are now all gone, it is deeply satisfying to find a large or veteran tree breaking all the rules. So that's the experience of finding for me, turning a corner. And actually there's, in the book, there's color illustrations, and illustration number 1 is exactly that. Just, I turned a corner in a lane and saw these 2 amazing large trees over in Essex, elm trees. So the next thing is, going into the woods with the clients, Bruce and Esther Carley and their daughters and members of Barn Club. As we pondered the timber that these trees would yield, some would be curved, some would be straight pieces. A buzzard flew in and sat on the topmost branches of the tallest tree. This was a tree, by the way, that was 93 feet tall, so a big one. From far below, we posed no threat, but possibly sparked curiosity in the bird. We all stopped to look up at it. I love this part of the project, to find the timber you will need by going direct to the trees. is a rare thing in today's world. For most timber framers, it's a matter of emailing a cutting list to a timber merchant. But to go and search for the right trees in the midst of an ancient wood, with history in all its shadows and its branches teeming with life, is a process that feels incredibly rewarding. So that, exactly what you're asking about. And I think Lynn or Esther were there on that day, and they could share some of their experiences as well, perhaps later on.
Yeah, be lovely.
And finally, we've moved to the carpentry section of the book. And here in the yard, the farmyard at the Carley's farmyard at Churchfield Farm, talking about tie beams, which are the main timbers tying the two outside walls together. For each cross frame, a tie beam is first chosen, inspected and oriented on the trestles. And one nice feature of the open truss is that the tie beams can undulate freely as they pass from one side of the barn to the other. The lines can follow the natural shape of a tree. Often they are whole trees, roughly squared with just one good fair face, perhaps an asymmetrical curve or a hump along their lengths. On ancient frames, like the barn I found at Wallington, even the bark still remains in places after hundreds of years of use. These trees as tie beams are fascinating, beautiful objects in themselves. They are usually the largest, longest timber in the frame, and they are at the heart of it. So that's, yeah, so that's the story of the tree from the wood to the barn, and still there it is. It's a tree, and that's what you experience when you walk inside.
That's fantastic. There's a question that's come through from Sean Hellman as well about, and I know you do address this in the book, about the potential from woodworm, and about, I think you choose the time of year that you harvest. Is that right, from memory?
Yes. Yeah, it's very important, because the woodworm are after the sap, of course, the sugars and the nutrients. So traditionally, elm you'd fell in early November, which is right at the start of the season. In fact, they've only pretty much just dropped their leaves. And I thought about that and thought, why would you do that? And I think it's because they come into blossom so early. Some of them will come into blossom in late December. So they're already, their sap flowing up through their stems, even in what we'd consider the middle of winter. So they're coming back to life to put all the energy to create these incredible flowers. Yeah, so that's maybe a month or 6 weeks, 2 months before they even come into leaf. So it's quite incredible. So I think that's the answer. But I take a precaution on some frames, some parts of the frame, to treat them with a borax solution, which Sean will know about, and it's a very benign type of woodworm killer, and in that it doesn't hurt bats or mammals, or it doesn't even hurt. I tried eating some of the salts; they don't taste nice, but they're not poisonous. Yes, I wouldn't advise doing that to anybody, I should say quickly, but I was just curious to know what these harmless salts tasted like. So I do that. I do treat the elm. And that seems to work.
So apart from, I think you use a chainsaw for actually cutting the trees down, and presumably the sort of initial milling. But apart from that, you choose to do it entirely by hand. And I'm really interested in that, I guess, that discipline, but that choice. It's presumably it takes longer, or maybe not. But what do you get, and what do the group of people doing it get from that decision?
Which one, to go to use hand tools? To
use hand tools, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't live in a world where there's no electricity or no power tools whatsoever. But I think it's really important to be really conscious about what machinery or power tools we decide to use. And so, yes, in terms of cutting trees down, felling them, chainsaws are pretty amazing. You've got to be incredibly careful with them, but they do the job quickly. I did try chopping a tree down with an axe when I was a teenager. It didn't go well. It's very hard to control the direction of fall. It was just purely an axe, which, I don't know how beavers do it, how they fell their trees, but so yeah, chainsaws are good for that. After that, when you're working with volunteers, there's absolutely no way that you want to have power tools around. It's just far, far too dangerous. But so to switch to hand tools, in themselves, it's incredibly liberating to use one. And I mean, I could dip into the book again because I described this very thing.
Yes.
Should I do that?
Absolutely. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So because I write about this, I think it's very important. I believe that when we think of making something and we set out to gather materials and the wherewithal to do it, we stand in a fork at the road. On one side, we see a well-trodden path of power tools and technology. On the other, a path of handwork, far less traveled by in our day and age. By taking the second path, as we did to make the Carley Barn, a different world opened up. Immediately, in the absence of machine noise, you can hear what you are doing as well as see it. You can hear background bird song or the soughing of the wind in the branches of the trees overhead as you work. And if you're able to source your raw material from your immediate natural surroundings, as I can in Hertfordshire, the knowledge of the natural world seeps into you unconsciously. And this connection on nature changes how you live. And I go on to talk about further along this less well-trodden path, a sort of intimacy grows, which is felt through the close partnership of hand tools, our hands, and the material itself. And sometimes when you are working, the distinctions and boundaries between these three break down, and you lose all sense of which is guiding which and which is following which. Something is simply appearing through itself. And this level of surrender to the process has an elegance and an incredible grace, which I feel certain is a shared experience among many craftspeople using hand tools. And so rather than just use hand tools because we have to, because they're safer, I think it's something else entirely. And it's really by working with volunteers where that really opened all of that up for me, because if you're paying someone to do it in the conventional timber framing business, they'll probably come along with a whole lot of power tools, and you don't really get into that world. But with volunteers, of course, it's completely different. So it'd be interesting to hear again some of the experiences of the Barn Club people.
Yeah, I'm really keen to, and certainly that passage that you've just read, that really resonated with me when I read it. And working with my hands as a gardener, but also as a musician, and sometimes you're playing something and your hands don't, you're thinking, how are they doing that? I'm not even thinking about it, and it's really powerful, I think.
Yeah, it is, and this experience of working with volunteers in a much slower pace, it's a slow build, and you also get a very different sense of what's really going on. The pieces of wood that come from the woods they weren't really just materials we were using. They became almost characters in themselves. So every part of the process, as different bits of wood came out from the store to be worked on, to be marked and cut, they were the actors in this scene. We were like the stagehands, but they were the ones that were rolling around, being turned, being cut, and coming together as if some kind of incredible ballet or something. But it did have that feeling. They were the stars, and we were sort of standbys, really. We were busy doing stuff, but you have a whole different sense of what's really going on as the frame comes together.
Really lovely way of putting it. There's three questions which sort of come, or maybe three questions that sort of from a different angle, but I think come together. So one is from Adrian, who says, are there any opportunities in this industry for apprentices? And then that ties into a question from Peter, who says, actually, we've got this great tradition of tree planting. Why does forestry and the craft of forestry have such a low profile? And we have a similar issue in the horticultural industry. It's not seen as an attractive career, which I find very strange because it's so rewarding. And then Matt was sort of asking away the other side of that, where nature is now being recognized for that green prescription of wellness. We know the healing power of nature, and all of that in a way that ties together. So I'm guessing that, there were one or two experienced sort of professionals within your group, but mostly they were people from another walk of life entirely who were doing this, I'm guessing, as something different and something that allowed them to step outside and almost they wouldn't have wanted to do it as a career. That wasn't the point, and they don't want to be paid to do it. The point is that they're loving just, as you say, taking their time, enjoying the process, not having to have any pressure on it. But I guess there's a few sort of things that I don't know, any thoughts about lost arts or lost crafts, but also that that sense of why people get involved in these things.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think Adrian's question about where you can learn timber framing, that in the resource section at the back of the book, there's the Carpenters Fellowship, which is a UK organisation. As far as the UK is concerned, you can get in touch with them, and they do training, official training courses that give qualifications. There's also the Apprentices Trust for the Built Environment. There's a group of apprentices, I think it's a dozen a year or something, and they experience a whole range of traditional crafts. So that's another source to look up, or the SPAB, the Society Protection of Ancient Buildings. They also run a kind of, it is an apprenticeship scheme, but it's more a taster of all the different crafts that building conservation people will come across. And then I should mention as well, where all the bits of the puzzle of how to put a timber frame like the one behind me together, all my questions about how do you do that joint, how do you lay those two bits of wood up and then project the joint and mark it, all of that was answered when I went on a course run by Joe Thompson, who's an amazing carpenter at the Wilden Downland Living Museum down in Sussex. And I think every year they run a series of 3 one-week-long courses that people, just anybody can sign up for. And then you can do that just for the pleasure, or it's quite a good way, as certainly as I found as a carpenter, to answer a lot of questions. And he does timber framing from scratch, he calls it. So he starts with the timber in the round and then takes it through with hand tools and so on. So that there are places you can go. And of course, if I'm doing a project, then I'll run courses as well for anybody to come and learn, have an introduction to timber framing. So you'll have to repeat Peter's question. I'm sorry. The point.
So that was around the low profile of the career.
Oh yeah.
And could we do more to inform careers counsellors, or promote it as an opportunity, I guess.
Yeah, I think some things have still got to, we've still got to develop as a society. So Barn Club, in a way, breaks new ground, although, as I say, it's a tradition as old as the hills, but there's been a 200-year-old break, where there's a link between local woodlands and a timber frame business or some sort of carpentry business. And in the past, that would have just been village carpentry. These days, it doesn't really exist in that way. So it's a process of rediscovering, amazingly, the link between a piece of wood and the tree that it came from. And it's not just an anonymous plank from B&Q, but it's actually something from a well-managed, cherished local wood or forest or hedgerow, come to that. And so there'll be, I think, as our society redefines our relationship with the natural world, which we clearly have to do, else, climate change and collapse of species will be upon us. So I think that the answer is that a lot of the industries, well, when forestry became an industry, that trouble is ahead. anything that becomes agriculture becomes an agricultural industry, you know that things are going to go wrong, because it's just there to make money. So we need to re-examine everything, including careers in woodland management, and the link then to the timber trade and to carpenters and people in their homes who want things made out of wood.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that answers Nick's question, who, was looking in terms of, Orwell's position of, being socialist and looking at the value of the community coming together. And, was asking whether actually it was common to build barns in this communal manner. And I think you talk about that in the book, and there's still, yes, in the Amish communities, they still do it, don't they? And I think so it's not a tradition that's died out entirely, but.
No, and I think it's not just in timber framing, although the amazing thing about timber framing, as I found working with volunteers, is that it's a very sort of easily accessible skill, which made me think this isn't an accident. They design these buildings this way, and the joints are this way, so that just people from the village could get on with it. We've become very specialized in our ideas about what somebody's skills are. So, you might be a timber frame carpenter, or you might be a horticulturalist. But I think in the past, certainly in rural life, people would have skills across a range. And I was very struck reading last summer a really good book about the tradition of thatching in Devon. And it made the point that in the 19th century, at least as far as records could stretch back to, everybody in the village could thatch. The postman could thatch. Everybody knew how to thatch. It wasn't just the thatcher came round and thatched the houses. They all knew how to do it. I was partly because it's the days before tarpaulins. So if you had a pile of faggots, you'd put a thatch on top to keep them dry. But it's more also, I think, that as communities, we were obviously close and knit. We depended on each other's for support, for survival and help. And so skills were shared because everybody could help out at the harvest, for example. So I think we to rediscover this aspect of local communities coming together to do stuff, which could include barns or planting trees.
Indeed. Well, I think that's a really good segue to our final theme,
Okay.
which so the community, and obviously the Barn Club is a club. That's half of the title of the book, is Barn Club, and as I say, it's great that we've got some of the volunteers that work with you here. I don't know if you want to sort of pick out a couple of themes initially. I mean, one of the things I'm interested about, partly because I can see myself doing it, is learning a new skill. Presumably that's why some people wanted to get involved. And I don't know if you've got one of the volunteers you think might have sort of particular experience to share on that.
Yes, I imagine they're all out there somewhere as attendees ready to participate. I think it would be really interesting to hear from two people, perhaps at either end of their professional careers. One would be Brian Bernard. I don't know if Brian, you're there, who had a life, well, he'll be able to say, but as far as I can gather, as an engineer, but with a fascination and love of woodwork. And he came along and joined a course. Also Laura, who is much younger, and she has not trained as a carpenter at all, but she's been involved in learning carpentry as a young woman in her early 20s. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear the two different perspectives about learning a new thing, a craft.
Great. So maybe Laura, if we start with you, and
yes,
and kind of
Hi, Laura.
Hey.
As a total novice, am I right? What attracted you to being involved?
Well, basically, I think I grew up in a really different environment. I come from quite a urban background, and I never really had the chance to learn any practical work and the chance of just being outside and working outside. And I think being able to build a building is a really cool skill. And this opportunity came my way and I took it.
And did you find it difficult to learn the craft, or was it, or I mean, I'm sure Robert's a wonderful teacher. Did it, naturally, or was it something that sort of you struggled with?
It's actually, I think it was quite easy at the beginning. Of course, you need to like think about all the concepts, and we were quite good students. I was always like taking notes and making sure I understood everything. But after a while, it became quite natural because I think I still have a lot to learn, but it seems to me that it's quite a simple approach. It's kind of the same thing over and over and over and over. And it's quite, don't know, it just comes naturally, I think. So I didn't really struggle, I think.
Great, fantastic. Brian, presumably, I mean, had you done woodwork before? Had you before this, or even if you hadn't raised a barn?
Yes, I'd done some woodwork at school, and I'd always done a bit of DIY, a bit of cabinet making, this sort of thing. So I was used to using the tools. What was interesting was the scaling up to the size of the timbers and the fact that none of them was straight. As Robert says, you buy a bit of timber from B&Q or somewhere and it's all planed up nice and square and you can measure from one bit to the next quite comfortably. But when you're trying to join one bit of Waney timber to another bit of Waney timber, and you can't just cut a square joint, you have to sort of scribe it in and know how to scribe it in and still keep the whole frame in a single plane. That was fascinating. And it was also the sort of camaraderie there, and it was very interesting talking to the professional framers and the sort of community that they have when they go off and do their, I can't remember the term Robert used in the book now, their community projects, both nationally and internationally. It's just a whole new environment. I mean, my working life was IT, sitting on a desk in front of a computer. So I've always enjoyed being outside doing something. And so bringing those things together made it really, really worthwhile and very interesting. There's things I'd not thought about before, you had to start thinking about. I've still not dabbled in the actual design of the barn. I think that would be another fascinating aspect to get into at some time.
So you're going to lead your own barn raising project next?
I'm probably getting a bit too old for that now. Yeah, a nice pipe dream, yeah.
Well, thank you both. That was great. And Robert, I guess the other interesting thing, I don't know if there was one or two people that actually saw the whole thing through, that, were there maybe in the woods choosing the trees, and then they're right at the end of the process as you nailed that bit of elm on the top of the barn.
Well, I think Lynn Sampson was there right at the start, and she was in the woods looking at the trees, as was Esther. So I don't know if Esther and Lynn are out there.
So Lynn's there. So
Great.
Lynn, it'd be really interesting to hear, I mean, what attracted you to being involved, but also, I guess, maybe your journey from that day in the trees to the final bit where the barn's there in front of us.
I don't know if Bruce, otherwise if Bruce Carley is there as well. Oh, there she is.
Hello. Yeah. The idea of seeing the whole project through is very inspiring, because you're led the whole way. I was led the whole way, because I have to say the woods was a bit down a track, so we tromped over a field to get to the woods, and then were guided through the woods to these magnificent trees. I wasn't involved in any of the hardcore chopping down of and milling, but I was in attendance most of the time, right until the barn raising, which was a fantastic community affair. And guided all the way, though, it has to be said.
Were you sort of particularly keen to be there all the time? Was it almost conscious decision you made that you really wanted to be a part of every bit of the process?
Oh yes, factoring in, yes, all sorts of things. It was a wonderful community effort, because you meet people that you wouldn't necessarily meet in your ordinary everyday life, and that's a really attractive thing about being part of a community, that you meet new people and you share part of their lives as well while everything is growing around you. So I appreciate that very much. Yes.
Thank you. And Esther and Bruce, I mean, the clients, you know, why didn't you just pay someone to build you a barn? I guess, you know, would that have been easier?
Well, I think we just wanted a bit more of a fulfilling way of life, of doing things, a more simple, you know, in its approach. And I think we're finding it more and more difficult to obtain in our sort of modern busy lives, and to find a sort of contentedness, would you say? We're sort of busy choosing technology over craftsmanship, and I've written a few words about sort of going into the woods, you know, sort of with Robert, because we've seen the whole process, haven't we, all the way through. And it was such a privilege to see this project through, from standing under the elm trees in our local woods and listening to the nature, particularly the birds, and seeing the deer and the buzzard, as Robert said, landing above us. And it was a very rewarding process, to felling the trees that we could see were dying up in the crowns, and to milling them and being involved in the carpentry work, to see it all slot together like this enormous jigsaw puzzle in front of us, and then to be raised up from the earth and to sort of have a meaning and a purpose, and then to go back and to protect the elm suckers as well that were coming, that where we'd left, we'd cut them down, by making deer baskets, sort of afterwards, to allow them to grow for somebody else, perhaps with the foresight to make use of them. So maybe like another cyclical process like what we've done, but perhaps with a community again, because the camaraderie was a real tonic to the time constraints of our modern lives.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how we felt about it all, didn't we?
And does the barn, I'm guessing the answer to this is yes, but does the barn mean more to you because of that connection with all the people that you built it with?
Yeah, absolutely. It was just unforgettable. It was just a wonderful experience from start to finish.
Yeah, so it's a lovely site. It's a beautiful site where the barn is, and to put just a standard kind of building there, tin roof or something like that, wouldn't have done the place justice. No. And the barn just sits in the landscape beautifully, and you walk into it and it gives a real magical feel in itself, and just sits so nicely and naturally in that environment. And people come down there now and are just blown away by just the sight of it, inside and out. It's just really lovely. And really actually nice space to be,
and use it for meditation and things like that, you know, just for the peace and tranquility. I mean, the site deserved the barn really to be built like that. It was just just a wonderful experience.
And we were inspired from volunteering on Robert's barn at his small holding, and that gave us, you know, we just had that vision there that we wanted the same sort of thing in our small holding as well. And it's just sat beautifully, and everyone was, I didn't know whether anyone was going to turn up. I didn't believe they would, and volunteer so much time, and I can't thank them enough now. So I really appreciate all the help and time that everyone gave up for that. It was really eye-opening.
Wonderful people as well.
Yeah, amazing people.
Yeah, really interesting, and just lovely. All sort of working together, weren't we, to build this fantastic timber frame structure. So yeah, it was wonderful. Couldn't have been any other way. It was brilliant.
That's fantastic. And I see this a lot in the community growing work I do. You know, everybody gets something from it. You know, wherever you come in the process, you know, if it's successful, it's you give and you get something in return. And I'm interested, I guess, in those people that had more experience already, you know, who had done a lot of work on this. You know, why is it attractive for people with that experience already, who maybe are doing it in their day jobs, to come and work on a project like this?
I think that's a really good question. And so perhaps, I don't know if Chris and Herbert, are you out there? Yeah, there were several timber framers who came and helped out at the courses. We had an intensive week where we needed to catch up quickly with finishing a frame off or a layup off, and then just joining in occasionally as volunteers as well. So that camaraderie that I think is, you know, at the core of timber framing was brought along as well by the professionals, as it were.
So Herbert, you're a surveyor and framer, is that right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
So what I guess, what did you get out of working on this project that you wouldn't do from your day-to-day job?
I think principally teaching others, and it's a very collective process in the sense that you gain more actually than you give, because you can see the joy in people's eyes as you're imparting knowledge to them, because principally it doesn't belong to us. You know, we are just vessels to pass that on to the future generation, and then from those in turn, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Chris, would you agree with that?
Have you got the right Chris, Robert?
A different Chris. Chris Phil, I was thinking of. Chris Phil, yeah. K-R-I-S.
Now that we've got you,
there's another Chris, which is fine.
That's fine. Well, let's hear from this Chris. The more Chris's, the better.
Well,
any thoughts really on
what
your?
Was sorry, give me a quick resume of that question again, because I was a bit surprised by.
Let's have a different question for you.
Okay.
What you got out of volunteering, really? Why you got involved? What you got out of it?
Well, I didn't volunteer on this project. But I mean, I have volunteered on other projects, and I have woofers on my land, and it's a really valuable experience. I always remember hearing from a guy called Viv about the experience of volunteering with Ben on the House in the Woods, and what was really valuable. You know, it's a really valuable experience for all the people involved there. You know, everyone gains.
Yeah.
And on barns, I mean, if anybody has seen the film Witness, and that fantastic barn raising scene and all those people working together, you know, it's helped by the music, of course. Did you have music, Robert, with your?
We had a barn. We did have a barn dance when it was done.
Yeah,
with a live band. Yeah.
Well, I'll leave this to the people who were involved.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to see you, Chris.
Thank you, Robert.
So the other Chris.
But I don't know.
The other Chris, yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, there you are, Chris.
Right, excellent.
Chris with a K.
Yeah, it made a really nice change, actually. Like, I've worked on a lot of different timber frames, but the community aspect was really important. I've had clients that have been involved before, but not to the scale of Barn Club. Like, they were committed. I turned up for a few weeks and helped move it on and got to see Robert again and a few other friends, and it was great. But there were people that were there for week after week after week. You know, they really made it. It's theirs. And it's something very different. The focus wasn't on the speed. It wasn't about getting it done yesterday. It was about forming a community as much as a barn. And it really showed.
I think that's really powerful. You know, and I think that demonstrates why people do get involved in projects like this. It isn't you know, it's the journey, you know, to the cliche, but it's the journey, isn't it? It's not, and if it takes longer, it's longer, that's fine.
But it brought a lot of different people together, people that had got skills and people that hadn't. And that's why I really enjoyed the frame raising, because it was a day when everyone was there, their friends, everyone that had worked on it, people that had come in for a little bit, and people that are there every single week. You know, we all got together and we had some fantastic conversations, and everyone owned a part of it. You know, it wasn't a barn that someone turned up and put up as a team and disappeared. You know, everyone owned it. There was someone had done some joint and someone had done something else, and it made it personable.
Yeah,
and it's a really well written piece at the end where you describe that, and you know you really get a sense of being there and the joy and exhilaration almost of the barn going up.
It gets ecstatic by the end. It's so amazing. It's a feeling that I've only really experienced in raising a barn, and particularly when it's up and it's basically done, so you can just spend half an hour and you just wander around in a semi-dazed state, and I could see it in the eyes of the other volunteers and the carpenters like Herbert and Chris, and and there's Rick came and Sam and other carpenters who must have done that thing before, but you walk around, it's suddenly you're inside it and it's popped up really quickly. These things don't take long to raise, and you're walking around. It's like, I don't know really, it's you're seeing it for the first time with all the joints connected in 3D with the spaces that it creates. It's just an extraordinary feeling, really extraordinary. I think it would be good to hear from perhaps Rob and Pete, because both Rob Mills and Pete Cutforth, if that's all right, to hear their story, because they were there from pretty much beginning to end, or joined in after doing a framing course.
That would be great. And just to say that if you have to go at 5:30, then just that's fine. Do leave. We're not sort of finishing on the dot, so we can carry on for a few minutes afterwards. So we're not we're not too time constrained. So Robert, you're unmuted. Should we start with you?
Yeah. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously been a fascinating project to work all the way through, and my connection was through the Woodland Trust that I volunteer with, and very interestingly, they have a strategy of planting a lot of trees, but it's not particularly well thought out what the end game is, and it seems very interesting to me that there's a connection to be made, as Robert's talked about, going into woods and using the wood, and having seen and also gone into the woods and carried timber out and seen what a great use can be made of the timber, and the country at the moment isn't really maximising the use of timber resources, and it would be great from my point of view to see some ongoing connections from all the tree planting that's happening into these local crafts and using that wood. And Pete and I have been trying very hard to persuade the Woodland Trust to try and get a community project going to build a barn on one of their sites. There's a huge site at Hartwood near St Albans where we've got great aspirations, and hopefully it may come to pass that we can get something going and get another project going like this, but it's just been a fantastic thing to be involved in. And I disagree with the lady that spoke near the beginning. I for one did not find it easy, not within my natural skill set, and projecting angles and plumb lines and the complexities of some of the joints required a lot of thought and a different way of thinking, and that's why it was a hugely satisfying project to be part of. It just made you think in a different way, and maybe not even a complex joint, something as simple as making a peg to hold a joint together can also be a great experience.
Thank you, Rob. Peter,
I just wanted to say, reading Robert's book just reminded me that it's just the best thing I've done for years, and just the excitement, the anticipation of a typical day there. If I can just summarize it quickly, I'd arrive after a 9-mile cycle ride through urban environments, and I'd come through the gate, and I was into a different world, a beautiful, as Bruce said, beautiful pastoral scene with the church in the background, and maybe the sound of people starting to chisel away, or the sound of the chatter of people finishing their first cup of tea. And then Robert would eventually get us started, and we'd have a briefing to begin with usually, and it would be maybe 5 minutes of what we were going to be doing that day, and maybe 10 or 15 minutes of a passionate expert exposition about the carpentry, or about the timber, or about the nature involved in the trees that were growing, which was just absorbing. And then you'd get on with an hour or two of chiseling away the joint, or drawing up, marking up the timbers, and trying to learn how to do the marking up. And there'd be a lot of puzzled looks, and Robert would be tremendously patient with teaching us what needed to be done, and teaching us which were the important bits. Some bits you could get away with doing surfaces that were rough, and other bits you needed the accuracy down to the nearest 0.5 millimeter. And so he'd guide us as to where you needed to focus the attention and the accuracy and the precision. And some of it is tremendously precise, as Robert sets out in the book. And then you'd have a break for lunch, and you'd see Esther coming by with the cakes or the food, which was terrific to see. That was a great surprise and a real pleasure to just have a break for half an hour and chat, and we'd solve all the world's problems. Just as well, we didn't get onto Brexit probably in those conversations. So, and then you'd have the afternoon doing the same thing again, and then a second cake would appear miraculously. So the whole thing was just fantastic, and reading the book just brings it all back. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So, Rob, I mean, there are a couple of questions still that we haven't got to, which was sort of some technical, does elm coppice, and how do we stage a national elm comeback? We can, I mean, if people want to hang around to hear a little bit about elm, they can do, but that's, I think, sort of as a ending to the formal bit, that was a lovely summary there from Peter. I don't know if you've got any just sort of final thoughts, Robert, before we either move on to the elm bit or.
I don't know if, yes, I think that the wonderful thing that almost by accident we discovered in Barn Club is that, you don't have to be a bloke who's had a lifelong passion for power tools and developed carpentry skills to engage in this. That really blew me away, that people could pick it up and engage with it and enjoy it with absolutely no background, and particularly that it's not limited to being a thing that men do at all. And so I don't know if there's just time, if we could stretch a little bit, just to hear from Beth Somerville, who's my niece, and Rachel, if she's there as well, just as a woman's perspective of entering this timber framing world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've already had, Laura finding it easy and Rob struggling, so but yeah, let's hear more
if that's possible. And then perhaps I could just read finally a final piece from the book.
Great. So Beth, should we start with you?
Hello, yeah, you can hear me.
Can you can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, well, for me, it was really interesting because I am a sewer, a seamstress, and that's a very typically female trade to be in. And so to go into a very male one, where, I mean, my dad's a carpenter, I know what power tools are like, and I would never go near many of them. But to be able to, just lift some of these huge pieces of timber, using levering and everything like that was amazing as a woman. And then to be able to cut a joint with, I mean, I kind of sweat a little bit, but I felt really empowered, and yeah, the pace of it was perfect. Yeah, it was amazing.
That's great. I was brought up by, my mother was a judge who firmly believed that there were no jobs that women couldn't do. So it's great to hear this is you know, the experience of this club as well. Rachel.
Yes, well, I had no earlier experience of working with wood, although my father actually trained as a woodworker, and he's not around anymore, but I'd like to think that he really would have liked to see me doing what I was doing with the barn. And I didn't actually work on the Carley's barn. I worked on the barn that Robert's sitting in right now.
Yeah.
And I really would want to endorse all the things that people have said so far about the fantastic camaraderie and the wonderful experience of working outside, the pleasures of working with hand tools so that you can have conversations and you can chat and you can overhear a joke that somebody else cracks. And that's what helps the camaraderie along, because you are all engaged in the little bit that you're working on at the time, but you can hear and sense what everybody else around you is doing as well at the same time. And I love the fact that it was completely leveling. And I remember a time when I was, I think it was Sam, I was using the two-handed saw with, and it just felt completely easy and natural to work with a man I hadn't known before that week. And, you know, there was a moment where I had been using a saw on my own, and I'd reached a knot in the wood and I couldn't get any further. And I asked him if he'd help me. And so we just set to with a two-handed saw. And it was just so, it was so natural. It just flowed in the most wonderful way. And, you know, and the friendships flowed because of the great food that Lydia provided in the time that I was working there. And just the immense pleasure, and then the sense of achievement. I worked for a solid week. I went on a week that Robert held at the start of his own barn process. And the group of us worked there all day, every day. And I had a wonderful experience because I was there with my son, and we were staying in Robert and Lydia's grain store. And it was a week in March when the days were beautifully dry and sunny, and the nights were so cold. The only thing that we had to keep us warm was the barrel of cider that was sitting inside of the grain barn. And we had a wonderful time, and I have marvelous memories. And it's just so wonderful to read, because much of what's written in the Barn Club is exactly true of Robert and Lydia's barn as well.
Thank you. That's really lovely. So, Robert, you wanted to share one last passage from the book?
Yes. And I realised as well that I haven't heard from Joel Hendry, who was the person that I'd always call upon to basically to lead the barn raisings, because it's very important that somebody who's got experience is able to do that, and he's definitely the man for that job. We're great friends, and it's a shame that he's not. I don't think he's here tonight. But the reading is right at the end, and I say, at this point in the raising, we'd all become part of something bigger than any of us. The barn, the elm trees, the carpenters, the volunteers and the onlookers. We were now all acting together in a scene from a tradition that was coming back to life. Everyone hushed, and Esther said the words that completely fitted the occasion. She thanked everyone for what they had done in whatever way, and welcomed the people who over time would visit the barn in the future, and the inspiration she hoped for them. It was an acknowledgement that every effort counts, and that everyone matters and is valued, including people who feel they are square pegs in round holes. The elm branch I had selected was passed along the long line of people, and each person passed their thanks and joy and good wishes along with it. It made its way into the barn, up the platforms of the tower to Bruce. Bruce held it aloft, and everyone cheered as he nailed it to the apex of the roof. I've never seen such a big smile as the one on Bruce's face at that moment.
Fantastic. And Joel is here. He
is. Oh, great.
Slightly
Hello, everyone.
exciting, Joel, but we can hear you, I think.
Hi.
It's a bit dark.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you
Right.
fine.
Lovely to see everyone.
Yeah, and Anne-Catherine as well.
Anne-Catherine as well, right. No, it was a very joyful experience and always a pleasure to be involved with Robert's enthusiasm for life, elms, trees, you know, the timber, and making these things happen. It's great. I like it very much.
Thanks,
Great. Well, I think we're 10 minutes over now, so we probably should call a halt. I'm afraid we didn't quite get to all the comments, but thank you, Robert, not just for this evening, but for writing such a wonderful book. And thank you to all the volunteers that took the time to join us and share their experiences. That really added to the evening. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming and listening and sharing all your thoughts in the comments as well. It's been really good. Thank you all, and have a good evening.
Thank you.